In November 1942, something extraordinary happened on the California coast. Crowds gathered at the Richmond shipyard, bracing themselves for what newspapers called a miracle of steel. The atmosphere buzzed with disbelief. How could an entire ocean-going vessel, a 441-foot Liberty ship, be built in just 4 days? As workers tightened the last bolts and welders wiped sweat from their foreheads, the gray hull of the Robert E. Peary gleamed under the morning sun. Cameras clicked, reporters shouted questions, and somewhere in the chaos, a young welder whispered, they said it couldn't be done. For days earlier, this ship had been nothing more than scattered plates of steel, thousands of prefabricated sections lying in neat rows across the yard. Now it stood ready to sail, a symbol of American industrial might. Even veteran shipbuilders watched in stunned silence. Decades of tradition had been overturned by a single revolutionary idea, that ships could be assembled like automobiles. When the whistle blew and the Peary slid gracefully into the bay, cheers erupted. Workers hugged, flags waved, and factory sirens howled in triumph. In that moment, the United States proved something the world hadn't yet believed, that freedom could be built not just with courage, but with speed. What had once taken months now took days. What had once demanded patience now demanded innovation. The Robert E. Peary wasn't just a ship. It was the day America's war machine learned to sprint. Before the Robert E. Peary stunned the world, before steel and sparks danced in Richmond skies, there was something even more extraordinary, the people who made it happen. They weren't master shipwrights, nor veterans of heavy industry. They were ordinary Americans, teachers, farmers, mechanics, waitresses, and mothers, suddenly turned into the fastest shipbuilders in history. When the United States entered World War II, its shipyards were empty, and its workforce untrained. But within months, millions of men and women answered the call. Many had never seen a ship before. Now they were welding hulls, riveting plates, and working 12-hour shifts under blinding arcs of light. The clang of steel became America's heartbeat. In Richmond, California, the air smelled of oil, sweat, and determination. Every day, buses arrived packed with new faces, some white, some black, some Mexican, some from the deep south, all chasing one promise, that together, they could build something bigger than themselves. Mothers worked night shifts while their sons fought overseas. Teenagers forged their futures alongside veterans of the Great Depression. And in those crowded roaring yards, every spark that flew off a welder's torch carried a silent vow, we will outbuild tyranny.
No single Aeromède, the Liberty Ship.
The miracle was the multitude, an army of hands guided by one purpose. Together, they turned raw steel into freedom's fleet. And long before the headlines celebrated speed, it was these nameless workers who built the foundation for the impossible. The man behind this industrial miracle was not a shipbuilder, not a naval architect, not even a sailor. His name was Henry J. Kaiser, a bold, restless builder who had spent his life constructing roads, dams, and dreams. When the U.S. government called for a massive shipbuilding program to replace vessels lost to German U-boats, Kaiser saw not a problem, but a challenge. And to him, challenges were invitations. America needed ships, fast. The Atlantic was bleeding. Allied convoys were being torn apart by submarines that prowled the sea like wolves. Every day, more merchant ships vanished beneath the waves, taking vital supplies and lives with them. Traditional shipyards worked with precision, but not with speed. They built one ship at a time, carefully, methodically, painfully slow. Kaiser, however, thought differently. He looked at the problem the way Henry Ford once looked at the automobile. What if ships could be built like cars? What if they could be assembled, not crafted, using prefabricated parts produced in parallel, brought together on a single line of progress? It was a gamble that defied every convention. Shipbuilders laughed. Experts called it impossible. Welding instead of riveting? Steel sections built by untrained hands? To them, Kaiser's idea was heresy. But Kaiser had built Hoover Dam, the impossible wall of concrete that tamed the Colorado River. He knew that with organization, faith, and fearless leadership, the unthinkable could become unstoppable. And so, in 1941, Henry J. Kaiser bet everything on an idea that would change the world. Not with cannons or tanks, but with blueprints, cranes, and the belief that America's greatest weapon was not its army, but its ability to build. When Henry J. Kaiser first set foot in a shipyard, he was stepping into a world he didn't understand. He had never laid a keel, never studied naval architecture, never built a vessel that could float. But that was precisely why he succeeded, because he wasn't limited by what couldn't be done. In 1940, America's shipyards were a fortress of old traditions. Designs were drawn by hand. Riveting was an art passed from father to son. Every step was deliberate, every mistake costly. For decades, the rhythm of hammers and rivets had defined the industry. But to Kaiser, that rhythm sounded like delay, and delay meant defeat. He walked the docks with his trademark energy, his fedora tilted forward, eyes scanning every movement. "We're not building ships," he told his foreman. "We're building time." Those words became gospel. Kaiser's vision was simple but radical: replace craftsmanship with coordination. Every nut, bolt, and steel plate would be built elsewhere, in small specialized plants, then brought together like pieces of a mechanical puzzle. It was the birth of the modular ship. Skeptics rolled their eyes. The U.S. Maritime Commission doubted him. Experienced shipwrights grumbled, "You can't teach a farmer to build a freighter." But Kaiser didn't need shipwrights, he needed believers. He recruited women, minorities, anyone willing to learn. He promised them a purpose, not just a paycheck. By the time the first Liberty ship's keel touched the slipway, the man who had never built a ship had built something far greater, a new way to think. And soon, that idea would move faster than any destroyer on the sea. In the early days of Kaiser's shipyards, doubt hung in the air like smoke from the welding torches. Experienced shipbuilders from the East Coast came to observe his operation, and left shaking their heads. To them, this wasn't shipbuilding. It was chaos. The workers were untrained. The tools were new. Welding replaced the time-honored hammering of rivets, and to traditionalists, that was unthinkable. "Welding will never hold," one old-timer muttered as sparks rained around him. "Ships will break apart the first time they hit a wave." But Kaiser didn't flinch. He simply smiled and said, "Then we'll weld better." He ordered his engineers to study every failure, every crack, every stress fracture. New welding schools opened right inside the shipyard. Women who had never held a torch learned to fuse steel with surgical precision. Within months, the impossible method became faster, stronger, and safer than anyone imagined. By late 1941, entire sections of ships were being welded together in record time. Hulls, decks, and engine rooms built side by side, waiting to be assembled. Critics watched in disbelief as cranes lifted massive pre-built sections into place like giant Lego blocks. Soon, skeptics fell silent. Ships that once took a year to complete were now finished in weeks, and not one sank due to faulty welding. When the first Liberty ships launched, newspapers called them ugly ducklings, mocking their boxy design and plain gray hulls. But sailors didn't care how they looked. They cared that they floated, carried supplies, and got the job done. By the time skeptics realized what Kaiser had built, it was too late. His shipyards were already rewriting the laws of war and industry. One night, as the shipyard slept beneath the dim glow of floodlights, Henry Kaiser stood on the catwalk overlooking a forest of cranes and steel frames. Below him, sparks lit the dark like constellations being born. It was here that the true spark of revolution struck, an idea so simple, yet so audacious, that it would transform not just shipbuilding, but industrial warfare itself. If Ford could build cars on an assembly line, why couldn't America build ships the same way? Kaiser didn't want one shipyard doing one job. He wanted dozens of factories working together, each one building parts of ships simultaneously. The bow, stern, engines, decks, bulkheads, all constructed separately, then shipped to one place for final assembly. It wasn't a shipyard anymore. It was an orchestra of steel. Every section was standardized. Every blueprint was simplified. Workers no longer needed years of apprenticeship. They needed coordination, discipline, and belief. The result was breathtaking. Production time fell by weeks, then by months. Critics had said shipbuilding could never be mechanized. But by 1942, Kaiser's yards looked more like automobile plants than docks. Conveyor belts moved parts instead of cars. Teams rotated shifts like clockwork, keeping the machines roaring 24 hours a day. When the first Liberty ship built under this system slid into the water, the world finally saw what American industry was capable of. Each vessel was a symbol of ingenuity, proof that brains could build faster than bombs could destroy. Kaiser's dream of an assembly line for ships had come true, and it was about to turn the tide of war. Before the war, ships were built with rivets. tens of thousands of them, hammered in by hand, each one sealing 2 plates of steel together. It was slow, loud, and exhausting. To shipbuilders of the old world, the ringing of hammers was the heartbeat of the industry. But to Henry Kaiser, that sound meant something else: wasted time. Kaiser's engineers proposed a daring alternative: welding. Instead of hammering thousands of rivets, molten metal would fuse plates together into one seamless structure. It was faster, lighter, and cheaper, but almost no one believed it could work on something as massive as an ocean ship. When welding began at Richmond, the old guard scoffed. They said welded joints would crack under pressure, that the first Liberty ship would tear apart in rough seas. Yet Kaiser's crews pressed on. Every day, sparks flew as hundreds of new welders, many of them women, learned to handle torches with surgeon-like precision. The results were immediate. A riveted joint took hours. A welded seam took minutes. The difference meant lives saved, convoy supplied, and victory accelerated. Soon, the clang of rivet guns faded into history. The rhythmic hiss of torches replaced it, a new music for a new era. Ship sections grew faster, smoother, stronger. What had once been a week of labor could now be done in a single shift. And when the first welded Liberty ships faced the storms of the Atlantic, they held firm. They didn't split. They didn't sink. They sailed. Kaiser's gamble had paid off, and the world would never build ships the same way again. Welding wasn't just a technique. It was a revolution in steel. By 1942, Kaiser shipyards were no longer just places of work, they were battlegrounds of belief.
On one side stood the future, innovation, speed, and the unknown.
On the other, tradition, proud, proven, and unwilling to yield. Every torch spark in Richmond was part of a quiet war between what was and what could be. Old shipbuilders, veterans of the docks, muttered that real ships take time. To them, the Liberty ships were clumsy, crude, and rushed. They shook their heads at the sight of untrained workers replacing craftsmen. Yet Kaiser's crews didn't have time for nostalgia. The Atlantic was a graveyard of Allied ships, and every delay meant more names lost to the sea. Kaiser's managers posted clocks across the yards, not to mark hours, but to count victory. Each rotation of the hands reminded workers that speed wasn't a luxury, it was a weapon. Still, challenges mounted. Steel shortages slowed production.
Équipement failed.
Workers collapsed from exhaustion. Fires broke out under the night sky, casting red light over cranes that never stopped moving. But Kaiser had built more than factories. He had built faith. He walked the yards daily, sleeves rolled up, shaking hands, shouting encouragement. To every tired worker, he reminded them why they were there. Every ship we launch is a lifeline. Every delay costs lives. Bit by bit, doubt faded. The impossible started to feel routine. And as the sun rose over rows of unfinished hulls, something new glimmered on the horizon. Not just ships, but a nation discovering its unstoppable rhythm. The fight against time was brutal. But in Richmond, time was losing. Before Richmond became a legend, it was nothing more than a quiet stretch of shoreline on San Francisco Bay, wind, mud, and empty fields. But when Henry J. Kaiser arrived, he didn't see emptiness. He saw potential. Within months, the still waters would roar with engines, cranes, and life. Construction began in 1941, and what rose from the earth was not just a shipyard, it was a city built for war. Roads were paved, rail lines stretched like veins across the land. An entire neighborhood sprang up to house the thousands of workers who poured in from every corner of America. By dawn, the skyline shimmered with cranes that stood taller than church steeples. By night, floodlights turned the docks into a blazing sea of motion. Ships took shape under the hands of welders and mechanics working shoulder to shoulder, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. Everything in Richmond ran with precision. Cafeterias fed thousands. Buses ran on tight schedules. Hospitals, schools, even daycare centers appeared almost overnight, all designed to keep the shipyard alive around the clock. Within a year, Richmond had become the beating industrial heart of the West Coast. At its peak, over 90,000 workers filled its 4 shipyards, producing Liberty ships at a speed the world had never seen. To outsiders, it was chaos, steel, smoke, and thunder. But to those who worked there, it was something else entirely. It was purpose. The Richmond shipyard wasn't just built to launch ships. It was built to launch hope, and from its docks, that hope would soon sail across oceans carrying the weight of a world at war. When federal inspectors first arrived at Richmond Shipyard, they expected order, blueprints followed to the inch, procedures checked and rechecked. What they found instead looked like madness. Welders darted between hull sections. Cranes lifted entire decks through the air while workers shouted over the roar of machinery. The yard seemed to be breaking every rule in the shipbuilding manual. And in a way, it was. Traditional shipyards operated with discipline and hierarchy. Every task had to wait for another to finish. But Kaiser's operation ran on a different kind of law motion. If something could move forward, it did. Workers didn't wait for permission. They made decisions on the spot. Lines blurred between departments. Engineers and welders worked side by side, solving problems as they appeared. The inspectors were horrified. "You can't build ships this way," one protested. "There's no order, no procedure." Kaiser simply grinned and replied, "There's order in progress." Then came the real shock. Despite the chaos, the ships were sound. Every weld passed inspection. Every engine roared to life. Every hull floated perfectly true. The lawless shipyard was outproducing every traditional yard in America, and doing it with workers who had never seen the ocean a year before. What the inspectors saw as recklessness was, in truth, controlled innovation, an industrial experiment running at full speed. By violating every old rule, Kaiser had written a new one. In times of war, perfection isn't precision, it's momentum. The lesson was clear: if America wanted to win, it couldn't build the old way anymore. They weren't shipbuilders.
Note l'or.
Not even engineers. Most had never seen a ship up close. They were farmers, waitresses, students, mechanics, suddenly thrown into a world of roaring furnaces and molten steel. Yet, in Henry Kaiser's yards, this untrained army was about to outbuild every navy on Earth. Posters across America read, "Women wanted for victory, apply within." Within weeks, mothers who once packed school lunches were welding hulls in 1,200-degree heat. Teenagers who barely finished high school were operating cranes the size of houses. African American and Mexican laborers, long shut out of industrial work, were suddenly essential, shoulder to shoulder on the assembly line. Kaiser didn't see gender or background. He saw potential. "If you can hold a torch," he said, "you can build a ship." Training took hours, not months. A new worker would be handed a mask, shown how to weld for 5 minutes, and then sent into production. Mistakes were inevitable. Sparks flew, steel warped and tempers flared, but speed was sacred. Each worker learned faster than any manual could teach. They called themselves Kaiser's Commandos. They worked through nights lit by the blue glare of welding arcs, driven by coffee, cigarettes, and a strange kind of pride. They weren't just making steel, they were making history. And in that chaos, something miraculous happened. Production times didn't just drop, they collapsed. A ship that once took a year could now be finished in less than a month. America's secret weapon wasn't a tank, or a plane, or even a new technology. It was ordinary people, doing extraordinary things, united by purpose, powered by belief, and fueled by speed. By late 1942, Kaiser shipyards were humming like vast mechanical hives. Sparks lit up the California sky as Liberty ships rolled off the lines faster than anyone thought humanly possible. But for Henry Kaiser, fast wasn't enough. He wanted impossible. One afternoon, Vice Admiral Emeryland, the man who once called Kaiser's ideas dangerous fantasy, visited Richmond for an inspection. Surrounded by reporters, he casually remarked, "Impressive progress, but nothing like true mass production." Clay Bedford, Kaiser's chief engineer, overheard him. He didn't argue. He smiled. Then he turned to his foreman and said, "Let's build one in 10 days."
The challenge spread through the yard like wildfire.
Thousands of workers signed their names on chalkboards, promising to break every record ever set. The target, a full 441-foot Liberty ship, from keel to launch, in less than 10 days. The chosen vessel would bear the name SS Robert E. Peary, after the Arctic explorer who dared to go where others wouldn't. Fitting. When the whistle blew at 1 minute past midnight, November 8, 1942, chaos turned into choreography. Trains delivered prefabricated steel sections by the hour.
Crâne swung massive eut le segment through the night.
Teams of welders worked in relay shifts, sparks from one crew's torches lighting the way for the next. Day by day, the impossible took shape.
The bow, the stern, the decks, all came together like pieces of a colossal puzzle.
Workers slept in their uniforms, ate on the go, and welded until their hands trembled. By the fourth day, the ship's outline towered above the bay, sleek, massive, and almost complete. Nobody could believe it. The 10-day miracle was about to become a 4-day legend. November 12, 1942, just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes since the first steel plate hit the slipway. At Richmond Shipyard No. 2, over 1,000 exhausted men and women stepped back from their masterpiece. The SS Robert E. Peary stood ready, 441 feet of welded steel gleaming in the California sun. Crowds flooded the docks. Navy officials, engineers, reporters, skeptics, and shipbuilders from across America who had come to see this publicity stunt fail. No one truly believed a ship that size could be completed in 4 days. And yet, there it was, every rivet replaced by smooth welds, every section perfectly fitted, the engine already tested and bolted in place. Henry Kaiser stood near the bow, his hat low against the wind, watching history unfold. As the final preparations began, a band struck up the national anthem. Families of workers cheered, waving flags made from scrap fabric. It wasn't just a launch, it was a declaration. At precisely 3:30 p.m., the gates released. The massive ship groaned, shuddered, and then with a thunderous rush, the SS Robert E. Peary slid into the San Francisco Bay. Water surged. Sirens wailed. Workers wept and hugged each other, their faces streaked with soot and disbelief. Vice Admiral Land himself could only whisper, 6 months ago, I'd have called this impossible. The impossible had just set sail. Reporters called it America's 4-day miracle. But for Kaiser's crew, it was proof of something far bigger, that innovation, not tradition, would win the war. In the aftermath of the Peary's launch, headlines screamed across America. 4-day ship stuns the Axis. From New York to London, the world demanded to know how Henry J. Kaiser, a man with no shipbuilding background, had outperformed the world's greatest industrial powers. Before 1941, Kaiser was best known for building highways and dams, not fleets. He was the outsider, the man who broke rules and deadlines alike. When the Navy first offered him a contract, the old shipbuilding establishment sneered. They called his ideas reckless, too fast, too cheap, too dangerous. But on that November morning, the skeptics went silent. The launch of the SS Robert E. Peary didn't just float a ship, it sank decades of industrial arrogance. The maritime elite, bound by slow bureaucracy and outdated techniques, suddenly realized that Kaiser's assembly line methods had rewritten the rules of production. In Washington, the Maritime Commission issued a rare statement. Mr. Kaiser's work represents a new industrial frontier. The speed of American production shall be our greatest weapon. Henry Kaiser became an overnight legend, the miracle shipbuilder. Factories across the nation adopted his modular system. Steel mills, truck plants, and even aircraft assembly lines borrowed his ideas. But for Kaiser, it wasn't about fame. Standing before his workers that evening, he said simply, "We didn't build a ship. We built a future, one where America never waits to be ready." That day, the old guard bowed to a builder who had redefined what impossible meant. By early 1943, Richmond Shipyard No. 2 no longer resembled a dockyard, it looked like a living machine. Fires from welding torches danced through the night, cranes groaned above endless rows of steel, and trains arrived every hour, unloading raw materials from across the country. This was Henry Kaiser's empire, a city of workers, built not on concrete and rivets, but on urgency and hope. Each Liberty ship began its life as hundreds of pre-assembled sections, built miles away in separate plants. The moment they arrived, they were lowered into place like puzzle pieces, hull, deck, engine, bridge, all welded with mathematical precision. It was an industrial symphony, sparks flying, hammers ringing, engines roaring. And at its center, 90,000 workers moved in perfect rhythm, 24 hours a day. There were women in overalls, veterans with missing fingers, farmers turned welders, and immigrants chasing a promise. None of them had built ships before, yet together they could launch one every 5 days. Reporters called it the assembly line that floats. The Germans called it the shipyard that never sleeps. Each Liberty ship leaving Richmond carried more than cargo. It carried the faith of a nation that refused to slow down.
In the cafeteria, a sign read,
Every hour counts.
Every welt saves lives.
By the end of 1943, Kaiser's yards had built 1/4 of all American merchant ships, enough steel to stretch from California to Berlin. The Richmond shipyards weren't just factories. They were forges where legends were made, and the future of Allied victory was welded into every plate of steel. While the guns thundered overseas, the true rhythm of America pulsed not on the battlefield, but in the factories, shipyards, and rail lines of the home front. In Richmond, the air trembled with the heartbeat of war, hammers striking steel, whistles echoing through fog, and welders' torches painting the night in sparks of orange fire. Every clang meant progress. Every ship meant survival. Women flooded the workforce, mothers, teachers, waitresses, stepping into roles once deemed impossible. They became welders, crane operators, riveters, and foremen. Posters called them Victory Girls. History would know them as Rosie the Riveters. Inside the shipyards, teamwork erased barriers. Black and white workers, men and women young and old, all shared the same purpose: speed, precision, victory. Shift after shift, they built ships faster than the enemy could sink them. One worker recalled, "We were tired, hungry, and sore, but we knew every plate we welded could bring a soldier home." Henry Kaiser understood this better than anyone. He didn't just build ships, he built a community. His workers had hospitals, childcare, and fair wages, things unheard of at the time. His philosophy was simple: if you take care of the people, they'll take care of the mission. By 1944, Kaiser shipyards had become symbols of unity and purpose. The workers weren't fighting on the front lines, but their hands, blackened by steel dust and sweat, kept freedom afloat. The heartbeat of the home front was human, and it was unstoppable. While the guns thundered overseas, the true rhythm of America pulsed not on the battlefield, but in the factories, shipyards, and rail lines of the home front. In Richmond, the air trembled with the heartbeat of war, hammers striking steel, whistles echoing through fog, and welders' torches painting the night in sparks of orange fire. Every clang meant progress. Every ship meant survival. Women flooded the workforce, mothers, teachers, waitresses, stepping into roles once deemed impossible. They became welders, crane operators, riveters, and foremen. Posters called them Victory Girls. History would know them as Rosie the Riveters. Inside the shipyards, teamwork erased barriers. Black and white workers, men and women young and old, all shared the same purpose: speed, precision, victory. Shift after shift, they built ships faster than the enemy could sink them. One worker recalled, "We were tired, hungry, and sore, but we knew every plate we welded could bring a soldier home." Henry Kaiser understood this better than anyone. He didn't just build ships, he built a community. His workers had hospitals, childcare, and fair wages, things unheard of at the time. His philosophy was simple: if you take care of the people, they'll take care of the mission. By 1944, Kaiser shipyards had become symbols of unity and purpose. The workers weren't fighting on the front lines, but their hands, blackened by steel dust and sweat, kept freedom afloat. The heartbeat of the home front was human, and it was unstoppable. By mid-1944, the horizon of every American port was lined with Liberty ships, hundreds of them, their gray hulls glinting under the rising sun. What had begun as an emergency program had become a miracle of logistics and courage. The Liberty Fleet was no longer a symbol of hope, it was the very backbone of Allied victory. Each ship carried more than cargo. They carried lifelines, fuel, food, ammunition, tanks, and medical supplies, flowing from the American coast to every front of the war. Every time one left port, workers stood silently along the docks, hats in hand, watching their creation vanish into the mist. They knew, somewhere across the world, a soldier's life depended on that ship's safe arrival. Convoys of Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic in endless formation, dozens abreast, escorted by destroyers and corvettes. When U-boats struck, the losses were painful, but replacements came faster than the enemy could count. For every ship sunk, 3 more rolled down Kaiser's slipways. British Admiral Sir Percy Noble once said, "The Allies did not run out of courage or strategy, they nearly ran out of ships."
And then came the Liberty Fleet.
By war's end, 2,710 Liberty ships had been built, more than any other class in history. They weren't beautiful, they weren't perfect, but they were unstoppable. Their crews called them the ugly ducklings that saved the world. And when the Liberty Fleet filled the seas, even the enemy understood. America had turned its factories into an army, and its workers into warriors. August 1945, the guns finally fell silent. Across Europe and the Pacific, the smoke cleared, revealing a world forever changed. In shipyards from Richmond to Portland, the thunder of welding and the hiss of steam slowly faded. The Liberty ships that once carried the lifeblood of war now sat anchored in peace, their decks scarred but proud. For Henry Kaiser and his workers, victory was bittersweet. The war had been their purpose, their reason to build, to believe, to endure the impossible. Now, they stood among the empty slipways, listening to echoes of a war they had helped end. America had not just defeated an enemy, it had transformed itself. Factories that once turned out ships now built homes, cars, and highways. Kaiser, ever the visionary, redirected his genius toward healing. He founded Kaiser Permanente, one of the first large-scale healthcare systems in the world, born from the same principle that guided his shipyards: take care of the people, and they will take care of the mission. But the Liberty ships did not fade quietly. Many continued to serve for decades, as cargo carriers, relief vessels, even floating classrooms. A few still sail today, museum ships that whisper of a time when ordinary people did extraordinary things. In the ashes of war, the legacy of the Liberty Fleet endured, a symbol not of destruction, but of what humanity can achieve when united by purpose. As one shipyard worker later wrote, "We didn't just build ships. We built the bridge between war and peace."